Welcome, my curious companions. Tonight, a tiny creature in the deep ocean has a quiet secret to share. We are going to follow it down, slowly, gently, through the real science of how something so small can reverse the flow of time itself. You will drift into deep, restful sleep. And somewhere along the way, the mystery of life renewing itself will softly begin to make sense. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives at the edge of the ocean just as daylight begins to leave. Not silence, exactly, but something closer to a softening. The air cools just slightly. The color drains from the sky in long, unhurried layers. Amber first, then a bruised violet, and then something almost gray, the color of old sea glass left smooth by decades of turning water. The waves keep arriving, as they always have, as they always will, each one carrying the weight of a journey measured in hundreds of miles, only to dissolve into foam at the shore and pull back again, quietly, without complaint. You can let the rhythm of that settle into you now. Slow in, slow out. Nothing more is required. Something worth noticing, gently, as the light fades, the ocean doesn't darken evenly. Red wavelengths disappear first, absorbed within the first few feet of water, leaving only blue and green to travel deeper. A slow, invisible filtration happening just beneath the surface, unremarkable and constant, every single dusk. By the time light reaches even moderate depths, the world beneath has already lost its warmth of color entirely, and the water continues on, quietly blue, into a dimness that arrives not all at once but gradually, the way sleep itself tends to arrive. Somewhere just below where that last light scatters into dimness, small bodies are moving, not swimming exactly, drifting. Jellyfish, ancient and unhurried, have been moving through the world's oceans for longer than almost anything else alive today. Their forms shaped not by ambition, but by water itself. They are, in the most literal sense, creatures of the current. Their bodies, soft, translucent, no harder than a loosely set gelatin, are made almost entirely of water, carrying no bones, no brain, no heart, and yet persisting, billions of years into the story of life on this planet, still here, still moving, still finding their way through the dark. There is something quietly remarkable about that, something almost like comfort in it. The way a jellyfish moves is less like swimming and more like breathing. A slow, rhythmic pulse, a gentle opening and closing, as though the ocean and the animal have long since reached a quiet agreement about how things should go. The bell contracts. Water is pushed gently backward. The body drifts forward. It requires almost nothing. And the ocean, for its part, asks almost nothing in return. The two simply continue together in a rhythm older than almost anything that could be named. Imagine for a moment resting like that, not fighting the current, not steering against it, but simply allowing it. The way a warm blanket settles over you without you having to do anything at all. The way a mug of something hot and sweet, cocoa maybe, or chamomile, warms your hands before you've even taken a sip. Some things ask nothing of you. They simply arrive and settle and stay. What makes jellyfish particularly interesting to observe at dusk is the way certain species begin to catch what little light remains. Some carry within their tissue a faint biological glow, not bright, not dramatic, but soft and intermittent, like an ember that hasn't quite decided to go out. This isn't something they choose. It simply happens. A chemical conversation between a molecule called luciferin and a specific enzyme, producing light without heat. A process so efficient that almost no energy is lost in the making of it. There is still mystery here, though, folded quietly into the phenomenon, including why so many deep-sea creatures, in places where no sunlight has ever reached, continue producing light that nothing in that darkness was ever obviously meant to see. These small, glowing bodies drift through the darkening water in loose, wordless communities, carried by invisible rivers within the sea, shaped by temperatures and pressures and the slow tilt of the earth itself. Forces so ancient they predate the very concept of memory. And yet here, in the most ordinary dusk, simply present, moving gently through the dark water, asking nothing. The ocean keeps moving. The light keeps fading. Something soft and enormous and patient is simply continuing, as it has for longer than anyone can quite hold in mind at once. And somewhere much closer, in the quiet of wherever you are now, something in you is beginning, slowly, to do the same. There is something worth sitting with quietly in the idea that a jellyfish is not quite a solid thing. Not in the way a stone is solid, or even the way a leaf is solid, pressed flat and fibrous, holding its shape against the wind. A jellyfish is something else entirely. Something closer to a thought that the ocean is still in the middle of having. Its body is composed, in the most literal sense, mostly of water, somewhere between 94 and 96%, depending on the species, the season, the particular depth of water it calls home. What remains, that small fraction of tissue and protein and salt, is what gives it form, what allows it to exist as a recognizable thing at all, rather than simply dissolving back into the sea it came from. And yet it holds together. Somehow, quietly, it holds. Part of what makes this possible is a pressure balance so precise it rarely gets mentioned. The water inside a jellyfish's tissues and the water surrounding it are kept in a state of near-perfect equilibrium. The same saltiness, the same density, maintaining a kind of molecular handshake across the membrane moment to moment without interruption. If that balance shifts even slightly, water moves across the tissue boundary on its own without any instruction, following gradients too small to feel. The jellyfish doesn't manage this. It simply exists within it, the way you exist within the quiet pressure of a room at night, held without knowing you are being held. Settle a little deeper now, if you can. Feel the weight of whatever surface is holding you, the warmth of it. Maybe there's still something warm nearby. A mug cooling gently on a nightstand, the last breath of a candle just put out, the particular heaviness of a blanket that has been warmed by your own body over the course of a long evening. Within the jellyfish, at a scale too small to see, a quiet kind of communication is always unfolding. Cells arranged in two thin layers, an outer surface that meets the water and an inner surface that faces inward, are constantly exchanging information, not through a brain, not through anything like thought, but through chemistry, through small signals passed from one cell to the next, the way a whisper travels down a long hallway, each person leaning slightly toward the next, the message arriving changed but still intact, still carrying something of where it began. This is how the jellyfish knows to contract. This is how it responds to a shift in temperature, a change in the saltiness of the surrounding water, the distant pressure of something large moving nearby. Its entire nervous system is a net, spread evenly across the bell with no center, no headquarters, no single place where decisions are made. Every part of it is, in some sense, equally aware. Every part of it listening, all at once, to the slow conversation of the sea. Interestingly, some jellyfish appear to follow daily vertical rhythms, rising toward the surface in certain hours, descending in others, without any light-sensing organs sophisticated enough to obviously explain it. Something in the tissue responds to cycles. The creature has no apparent means of tracking, carrying a rhythm without storing it, the way a tide carries the memory of the moon without understanding its own motion. The tissues of the jellyfish are also, in their way, a kind of memory. Not the kind that stores images or names or the particular feeling of a good afternoon, but a structural memory. The way proteins fold themselves into forms that persist, that resist dissolution, that maintain just enough architecture to keep the creature recognizable from one moment to the next. Identity held loosely. Form understood not as a fixed thing, but as a tendency, a preference, a soft, ongoing lean in one direction. There is something familiar in that, if you let yourself feel for it. The way you, too, are mostly water, the way the body you inhabit is less a finished object than a process, something always quietly rebuilding itself. Cells replaced, structures reorganized. The you of this moment, not quite the same as the you of last week, and yet still unmistakably, continuously, you. The jellyfish drifts on, unbothered by any of this. Its cells continue their slow conversation. Its form continues its patient negotiation with the surrounding sea, and it does not need to understand itself to remain itself. And perhaps, for now, neither do you. There is a particular species of jellyfish, small, almost unremarkable to the eye, no wider across than a thumbnail, that does something the natural world very rarely permits. Something that, when you hold the idea of it gently and without rushing, begins to feel less like a biological fact and more like a very quiet kind of poetry. When this creature is stressed, when the water around it grows too warm or too cold, or when it has been injured, or simply when it has lived long enough to reach the natural end of its adult form, it does not die. Not exactly. Instead, it begins, slowly and without any apparent urgency, to reverse. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way a fire doesn't suddenly go out, it dims, it settles, it draws inward, becoming less of what it was and more of what it might become again. And so does this creature, its bell contracting, its body folding back toward something earlier and simpler, something it had been long before it became what it was. It is, in the most careful scientific sense of the phrase, a process called transdifferentiation. The ability of a mature, fully specialized cell to shift its identity, to step back from what it had become and take on an entirely different role. A cell that had become one thing, a muscle cell, say, or a cell responsible for sensing light, quietly releasing that identity, returning to something more open, something not yet decided, the way a day releases into evening without any particular moment you can point to and call the change. What seems to be happening at the level of individual cells is a conversation between proteins, signals arriving that tell the cell to loosen its commitments, to reopen possibilities that had long been considered closed. Certain genes that had been silenced during the creature's development appear to become readable again, like text that had been covered and is now very slowly uncovered. The instructions, always having been there, simply set aside, waiting patiently in the architecture of the cell for conditions that might call them forward again. What results from this process is something scientists describe as a cyst, a resting form, compact and still, from which the creature can, in time, begin again. Not continue. Begin. The cells reorganize themselves into the structure of a much younger organism, one that will eventually grow again into the adult form, and the whole arc of its life can start over from somewhere near the beginning, quietly, without announcement. The slowness of this reversal is worth staying with. It does not happen overnight, and it does not look like urgency from the outside. More like the way snow settles into the shape of whatever it covers, not erasing the landscape but offering it a quieter version of itself, one contour at a time, over the course of a long and unhurried night. There is something else, too, folded into this process almost incidentally. The proteins involved in guiding cellular identity are among the most chemically stable structures biology produces, some of them folding into shapes so precise and so resistant to disruption that they persist long after the cells around them have changed entirely. Stability and transformation, running alongside one another in the same tissue at the same moment, without contradiction, the way a river can be both still at its edges and moving swiftly at its center. Your own body, right now, is engaged in processes not entirely unlike this. Not transdifferentiation, of course, but the same deep logic of cellular renewal, proteins being dismantled and reassembled, structures quietly maintained in the dark. A billion small negotiations happening beneath the surface of awareness, each one asking nothing of you, requiring no oversight, no instruction, no active participation whatsoever. The jellyfish rests in its cyst. The cells settle into something earlier and more open. The molecular signals continue their slow, patient conversation, on a timescale measured not in hours, but in the long, unhurried language of biology itself. Forces so ancient they seem almost indifferent to time. Not because time doesn't matter, but because at this depth of process it moves the way deep water moves, steadily, quietly, in a direction you can feel but not quite see. The ocean is not always a gentle place. Beneath its surface, beauty. The slow drift of light through blue-green water, the quiet processions of life moving in every direction. There are pressures, shifts. The water warms by fractions of a degree, and something, somewhere, responds. The chemistry of the sea changes with the seasons, with the depth, with the particular movement of currents that travel thousands of miles before arriving, changed and tired at some distant shore. The ocean breathes in its way, and like anything that breathes, it moves between states of ease and states of strain, between openness and the need to draw inward for a while. When the jellyfish encounters these harder conditions, water that has grown too warm or too cold, or water where food has become scarce and the familiar rhythms have shifted, it does not push against them. It does not attempt to endure through force. Instead, in that same slow and unhurried manner that characterizes everything it does, it retreats. It folds back toward its earliest form, the polyp. A small anchored structure, almost plant-like in its stillness, attached to a surface on the sea floor or along the underside of a rock, simply waiting. The way certain things wait without impatience for the conditions around them to soften again. There is something worth pausing on, briefly, in how the polyp anchors itself. It produces a thin chemical secretion that allows it to bind to surfaces. Rock, shell, occasionally the hull of a vessel that has traveled far from where the creature began. The polyp has no awareness of where it has attached. And yet the chemistry of that bond is specific enough and strong enough to hold through currents that would displace almost anything not rooted by something far more obvious. Quiet adhesion, accomplished entirely without intention, holding simply because the conditions for holding are met. There is something deeply restful in that image, the idea of stillness chosen not as defeat, but as a form of patience, of becoming smaller and simpler and less exposed until the world outside arranges itself into something more welcoming again. Maybe there is a soft blanket pulled up close right now, or the particular warmth that gathers between you and wherever you are lying. The room around you asking nothing. The night outside quiet and patient and vast. The polyp stage is, in its way, a sanctuary. The creature in this form requires very little, minimal energy, minimal resources, minimal interaction with the turbulent world above it, and it simply persists anchored and still while the conditions around it continue their slow rearrangement, the way a seed persists through winter, not pushing, not hurrying, simply holding the possibility of what it might become. And yet, even within this retreat, the jellyfish remains woven into something much larger than itself. The ocean is a web of relationships, delicate and intricate, built over billions of years into a balance that holds, most of the time, without anyone managing it. Within that web, the jellyfish is not only a drifter and a resetter, it is also food. Sea turtles seek it out, certain fish, seabirds that plunge into the shallows at dusk. Even other jellyfish, in their unhurried way, will consume what they can. It is also worth noticing, quietly, that jellyfish themselves consume in ways that are easy to overlook, filtering microscopic organisms from the water simply by moving through it, their trailing structures acting as passive nets, gathering without any deliberate act of hunting. Predator and filter and drifter, all at once without apparent effort, each role folding into the other so gradually that no single label quite captures what the creature is. The immortality of this creature, if that word can even be used with something this soft and conditional, is not an escape from the world's terms. It is more like a reprieve, a quiet extension made possible only when circumstances allow. Fragile in the way that most beautiful things are fragile, real and impermanent and dependent on everything around it, continuing in its own patient way. The deep water holds all of this. The stillness of the polyp clinging to its rock, the slow chemical signals of survival, the ancient movements of warm and cold water passing one another in the dark, a system in balance, not because anything is in control, but because enough forces over enough time have settled into a kind of agreement, quiet, patient, ongoing. Pull back now, very slowly, the way a camera might rise above the surface of the ocean at night. Past the jellyfish, past the polyp resting on its quiet rock, past the shifting layers of warm and cold water moving through one another in the dark. And keep rising until the ocean itself becomes a suggestion. A shimmer, a thin, curved skin of blue wrapped around something enormous and patient and very, very old. Billions of years of slow rearrangement. Continents drifting like unhurried thoughts across the surface of the planet, oceans opening and closing over millennia, life arriving in one form and dissolving back into the chemistry from which it came, not lost, but returned, carried back into the system the way water is carried back into the sea. The jellyfish drifts on, somewhere below all of this thinking, small and translucent, pulsing gently in the dark water as it has for longer than the mind can comfortably hold. Its lineage stretching back through time so vast it begins to feel less like history and more like weather, something that simply surrounds everything, always present, rarely noticed. Something moves very quietly beneath all of this. The carbon that makes up the jellyfish's tissue was once atmospheric gas, absorbed into the ocean over centuries, passed through countless bodies before arriving here, in this creature, in this particular stretch of dark water. It will move on again, slowly, without ceremony, the way everything eventually moves on, carried forward by the same patient forces that have always been at work, long before anything was alive to observe them. The pattern continues. In the forest, after fire. In the star, at the end of its long arc. In the water cycling through cloud and rain and river and sea, complexity gathering itself quietly, and then, just as quietly, releasing, not ending, only changing form, finding its way back into the current, the way the jellyfish finds its way back to an earlier version of itself when the conditions around it ask for something simpler. The night around you is filled with this, in every direction. Trees breathing slowly in the dark. Water moving underground through passages no light has ever entered. Stars overhead, still sending their light outward into distances that make the word distant seem too small. Light that left its source before certain rivers had found their shape, arriving now, softly, still traveling, still continuing. The jellyfish drifts, its bell opens, closes, opens again. The water around it carries it gently, without destination, through the dark. The chemical conversation inside its tissue continues, patient and unhurried, in the language that preceded all others. The polyp, somewhere below, holds to its surface. The current moves past without disturbing it. Something in the deep water glows, briefly, and then does not. The ocean continues. The slow pulse continues. The dark water holds everything gently, without effort, the way it always has. Not asking, not arriving anywhere in particular, simply moving, as it will long after the last thought of this evening has softened and dissolved and drifted somewhere beyond the reach of the waking mind. Somewhere out there, the jellyfish is still drifting, still opening, still closing, still carried. If these quiet wanderings have made your evening a little softer, you're always welcome back. Subscribing keeps the lantern lit and helps other weary minds find their way here too. Now let the questions settle. There's nothing left to figure out tonight. Rest easy, and I'll see you in the next quiet Why.